The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You don't have to have a college degree to serve. You don't have to make your subject and verb agree to serve. You only need a heart full of grace and a soul generated by love." Service to humanity, inspiring moral uplift, and building a beloved community, those were the values that guided King's life, and those are the luminous elements of his legacy, the legacy of a great king who was among us. Born Michael King Jr. on January 15, 1929, to the black middle-class King family, Martin Luther King Jr. was the middle child of Reverend Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. His maternal grandfather, Reverend A.D. Williams, began the family's long tenure as pastors of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, serving from 1914 to 1931. Reverend Williams had been a royal minister for years and in 1893 moved to Atlanta, where he took over the struggling Ebenezer Baptist Church. It was a small church with around 13 members. Both the King and Williams families were rooted and established in rural Georgia. Michael King Sr. came from a sharecropper family in a poor farming community. He married Alberta in 1926 after an 8-year courtship. The newlyweds moved to A.D. Williams' home in Atlanta. Michael King Sr. stepped in as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church upon the death of his father-in-law in 1931. He, too, became a very successful minister and adopted the name Martin Luther King Sr. in honor of the German Protestant religious leader Martin Luther. In due time, Martin's senior son, born Michael, would follow his dad's lead and adopt the name himself. Young Martin had an older sister, Willie Christine, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams King. The King children grew up in a secure and loving environment. Though they tried, Martin Jr.'s parents could not shield him completely from racism. Martin Luther King Sr. fought against racial prejudice not just because his race suffered, but because he considered racism and segregation to be an affront to God's will. He strongly discouraged any sense of class superiority in his children, which left a lasting impression on young Martin. At age 5, Martin Jr. entered public school. Growing up in Atlanta, Martin Jr. attended the segregated public schools in Georgia. In May 1936, he was baptized, but the event made little impression on him. In 1941, Martin was 12 years old when his grandmother Jenny died of a heart attack. The event was more traumatic for Martin because he was out watching a parade against his parents' wishes when she died. Distraught at the news, young Martin attempted suicide by leaping from a second-story window at the family home. A precocious student, when he attended Booker T. Washington High School, he skipped both the 9th and 11th grades, graduating from high school early, and at age 15 entered Morehouse College in Atlanta in 1944. King was popular, especially with the girls, but was an unmotivated student who floated through his first 2 years of college. Although his family was deeply involved in the church and worship, young King questioned religion in general. He felt uncomfortable with overly emotional displays of religious worship. This discomfort initially led him to decide against entering the ministry. However, in his junior year at Morehouse College, Martin took a Bible class, renewed his faith, and began to envision a career in the ministry. In 1948, Martin Luther King Jr. earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from Morehouse College, the same college from which both his father and grandfather had graduated. King went on to study at the liberal Crozer Theology Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he was elected president of a predominantly white senior class. He earned his Bachelor of Divinity in 1951. Martin also rebelled against his father's more conservative influence by drinking beer and playing pool while pursuing his studies. He became involved with a white woman and went through a difficult time before he could break off the relationship. During his last year in seminary, Martin Luther King Jr. came under the influence of theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, a classmate of his father's at Morehouse College. Niebuhr became a mentor to Martin, challenging his liberal views of theology. Niebuhr was probably the single most important influence in Martin's intellectual and spiritual development. After being accepted at several colleges for his doctoral study, including Yale and Edinburgh in Scotland, Martin enrolled in graduate studies at Boston University. While in Boston, he pledged to Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. During this time, he also met Coretta Scott, an aspiring singer and musician at the New England Conservatory School in Boston. They remarried in June 1953 and eventually had 4 children: Yolanda, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott, and Bernice. In 1954, while still working on his dissertation, King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. He completed his Ph.D. and was awarded his degree in 1955. Always a strong worker for civil rights for members of his race, King was by this time a member of the Executive Committee of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the leading organization of its kind in the nation. He was ready then, early in December 1955, to accept the leadership of the great nonviolent demonstration, the Montgomery bus boycott. The boycott lasted 382 days. On December 21, 1956, after the Supreme Court of the United States had declared unconstitutional the law requiring segregation on buses, blacks and whites rode the buses as equals. During these days of boycott, King was arrested, his home was bombed, he was subjected to personal abuse, but at the same time he emerged as a black leader of the first rank. Having come from a long line of leaders, King was poised to assume leadership roles in the struggle for civil rights. In 1957, he was elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization formed to provide new leadership for the burgeoning civil rights movement. The ideals for this organization they took from Christianity, its operational techniques from Mahatma Gandhi. In the 11-year period between 1957 and 1968, King traveled over 6 million miles and spoke over 2,500 times, appearing wherever there was injustice, protest, and action. This was at a time when it was difficult for blacks to travel due to hotel segregation and other challenges. Throughout his life, he wrote 5 books as well as numerous articles. In these years, he led a massive protest in Birmingham, Alabama, that caught the attention of the entire world, providing what he called a coalition of conscience and inspiring his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, a manifesto of the Black Revolution. He planned the drives in Alabama for the registration of blacks as voters. He directed the peaceful march in Washington, D.C. of 250,000 people to whom he delivered his address, I Have a Dream. It was here in Detroit, Michigan, that King delivered his first original version of the speech. King visited Detroit numerous occasions as early as the 1940s when he visited Second Baptist Church with his father, who preached at Detroit's oldest church. King later visited Detroit to garner support for the civil rights movement among Detroit's Union movement, led by Walter Reuther, Reverend Horace Sheffield II, and many others. Politically, King conferred with President John F. Kennedy and campaigned for President Lyndon B. Johnson. He was arrested upwards of 20 times and assaulted at least 4 times. He was awarded numerous honorary degrees, was named Man of the Year by Time magazine in 1963, and became a symbolic world figure. In 1964, at the age of 35, Martin Luther King Jr. was the youngest man to have received the Nobel Peace Prize. When notified of his selection, he announced that he would turn over the prize money of $54,123 to the furtherance of the civil rights movement. His leadership was fundamental to that movement's success in ending the legal segregation of African Americans in the South and other parts of the United States. More than a Baptist minister, Martin Luther King Jr. was a social activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States. On the evening of April 4, 1968, while standing on the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was to lead a protest march in sympathy with striking garbage workers of that city, he was assassinated. Only days later, 1,000 National Guardsmen watched while 19,000 people participated in a peaceful march led by King's widow, Coretta Scott King. Channeling her grief, Mrs. King concentrated her energies on fulfilling her husband's work by building the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change as a living memorial to her husband's life and dream. Years of planning, fundraising, and lobbying lay ahead, but Mrs. King would not be deterred, nor did she neglect direct involvement in the causes her husband had championed. In 1974, she formed the Full Employment Action Council, a broad coalition of over 100 religious, labor, business, civil, and women's rights organizations dedicated to a national policy of full employment and equal economic opportunity. Mrs. King served as co-chair of the council. Mrs. King maintained her husband's commitment to the cause of economic justice. Mrs. King continued to serve the cause of justice and human rights. Her travels took her throughout the world on goodwill missions to Africa, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Mrs. King led the successful campaign to establish Dr. King's birthday, January 15th, as a national holiday in the United States. By an act of Congress, the first national observance of the holiday took place in 1986. Dr. King's birthday is now marked by annual celebrations in over 100 countries. In 1985, Mrs. King and 3 of her children were arrested at the South African Embassy in Washington, D.C., for protesting against that country's apartheid system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement. 10 years later, she stood with Nelson Mandela in Johannesburg when he was sworn in as the President of South Africa. The Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial, dedicated October 11, 2011, honors a man of conscience, a man who shared his message of freedom, equality, justice, and love with the world. It is the first memorial on the National Mall devoted not to a U.S. president or war hero, but a citizen activist for civil rights and peace.
To my Lord and be free. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. And before I'd be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord.